Hello everyone, at this point we already finished learning the frequency, relative frequency, percent frequency, cumulative frequency distribution for one quantitative data. So those are belong to called the tabular visualization because they are tables. Now we're going to move on called the graphical visualization. So we are creating a diagram to representing our quantitative data. So that is called a histogram, okay, histogram. So before we look at histogram, I want to call out our frequency distribution we already learned. So basically, histogram will reveal exactly the same information as the frequency distribution you created for your quantitative data. The difference is we are able to see a diagram that's easy for your audience to digest versus looking at a bunch of numbers itself. So let's look at our histogram for our P ratio example together. So here are listing our three different kind of P ratio with a different number of the classes. So the first is with the 6 classes, the second with the 8 classes, and the last one with 9 classes. And so, like I said, when you look at the table, sometimes it's really hard to get insight that obviously because it's just a bunch of numbers. However, when you look at a diagram, like here what we're seeing here, when we have the 6 bins and the majority of the our stock are with a PE ratio between 10 and 20, and when we look at the 8 bins, so we notice that majority of stock are having the a P ratio between 8 and 24, right? So as you can see that it's more obvious than the tables. Like I said, if your audience are less are very broad, and you don't know if they have a strong statistical background, using the graph is better than the table. Okay, so what is the characteristic of our histogram? So for our histogram, our vertical axis, which we also call y-axis, that are showing us the frequency of each class or each bin. And our horizontal axis that is showing the endpoint of each bin. So basically are the class width. Remember in the frequency distribution we already practiced in the previous video. So we have 6 classes. The first class 0 to 10, second class 10 to 20. As you look at our histogram here, and the first class 0 to 10, 10 to 20. So you can see the horizontal axis literally are labeling for our classes. And the vertical axis is telling us how many of the raw data is belong to each class. So as you can see, for our first 0 to 10, if you remember, the frequency was 2, and the second class 10 to 20, the frequency was 24. So instead of reading the number, now we are able to be more obviously seen on the diagram. So it's really easier for us to derive the business insight. So therefore, in most business settings, so the histogram is more preferred than the frequency distribution because it tells us the same information, but it's more easily to reveal the insight. So in the next video, we're going to look at how can we use Excel to creating our histograms. But before that, we want to know, hey, if we are able to obtain our histogram, and how can we interpret it? Okay. So generally speaking, when we look at histogram, we focus on the skewness, whether they are left skewed or right skewed. Okay, right skewed or left skewed. Here is one thing you need to think about. So when we think about the right skewed, okay, I'm showing you. So how do you know when is left skewed and when is the right skewed? I always tell my student, when you look at the distribution, the ones look like a stretching like this, thinking about your yoga pose, right? So this is considered as I stretch my leg towards the left. If that's the case, called the left skewed. If I stretch my leg towards the right, we call the right skewed. So if you see any distribution, you notice the right and the left legs stretch the same, we call symmetric. Okay, so the left skew also called negative skewed, and the right skew also called the positive skewed. So in the statistical, we call this as called a tail. So we don't call it legs, but I do want to help you to link with the yoga pose if you do yoga. So if you stretch your leg to the right like this, that will be right skewed. Stretch your leg to the left, that will be left skewed. Okay, so that's one thing you need to read when you look at a histogram. You need to be able to interpret it. Okay, here is a few more example. So you can see the first one, left skewed, symmetric, right skewed. And also for the first row, you see that we only have one peak. So that is what we, it's okay. So it's like, later we're gonna look at called normal distribution. But for the second row here, we see, although like this one skewed, we see the tail towards in the left, but we see a 2 peak. So when you have the different number of the peak, when you have more than one peak, we give different names. So when you have 2 peak, we call it bimodal. And if you have more than 2 peak, we call it multimodal. Okay, so like this, the first one in the second row here. Okay, so for this one, we have 2 peak, so therefore it's bimodal. And then it's the skew to the left because the tail is stretching toward the left. And the third, this one, we also have 2 peak and the leg stretch to the right, so we call it bimodal, 2 peak, and the skew to the right. And for this one, if you find the middle point, you draw a line, you can see that the lines left and the right are look exactly the same. So therefore they are symmetric, but we have 1, 2, 3 peak, so therefore we call it multimodal. Okay, and then if we had a histogram look like this one, we call it head outliers because your tail will break down. So that means we have like extremely small value here. And the similar for here, so if you draw a line in the middle, the left and the right look exactly the same, but you can see the tail are broke down. So they are not continuous. That means those are my outliers. And the same for this one. Stretch to the right, but the tail somehow break down. We have these 2 isolated from the rest of the graph, so these are considered as outliers. Yes, using the histogram can help us visually to identify the preliminary outliers. So we need to use some kind of statistic numbers to identify if they are actually our outliers. So we're going to look at that in our next chapter. So these are the histogram and what you are going to read when you look at the histogram. So now we're going to move on to the next video is learn how to use Excel to creating our histogram.